And joining me now is Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. Senator Lankford, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you. Good Sunday morning to you.
Good Sunday morning to you. Thank you for being here. Let's start right there with President Trump's decision to deploy the National Guard, 2,000 troops. He says it is the first time that a president will have deployed the National Guard without a governor's sign-off since 1965. How do you respond to Governor Newsom, who says that this move will only escalate tensions?
Yeah, I think what President Trump's trying to do is pretty clear. He's trying to de-escalate all the tensions that are there. We're watching as Americans scenes of burning cars in intersections and people waving American flags at local law enforcement, concrete blocks being thrown at federal law enforcement. We watched this kind of scene 5-6 years ago when there was a takeover in the Northwest around Seattle and Portland. When we watched all that happen and local law enforcement was being challenged over and over again, it finally took a National Guard presence to be able to bring it down after weeks. What President Trump is trying to do is say, this is not going to take weeks this time. We're not going to allow this to be able to spiral out of control. This is an American city. And to be able to have an American city where we have people literally flying Mexican flags and saying, you cannot arrest us, cannot be allowed. If someone violates the law, no matter what state that they're in violation of a federal law, they should face consequences for that.
Well, you know, Senator, Governor Newsom says there is no unmet law enforcement need. The LAPD says the protests were peaceful. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth now warning active duty Marines could be mobilized. Would you support mobilizing the Marines, and do you think Congress would need to sign off on that first?
Yeah, well, active duty Marines are not going to be put into local law enforcement. They would be in support roles on it, as we have in the border. We have active duty military at the border, but they're not doing law enforcement tasks. They're doing logistical tasks behind the scenes. Local law enforcement should take care of this. But again, when you're seeing burning cars and federal law enforcement being attacked on the streets and with thousands of LAPD, which, by the way, do a great job. The LAPD has a great task in front of them, and they're meeting that task with a great opportunity to be able to actually enforce the law. But it's clear that they're being overwhelmed, and as the protests rise, we want to make sure those protests actually don't spiral out of control. Again, this wouldn't be an issue if California didn't promote sanctuary city policies to be able to tell people literally you can violate federal law and live in our state, and no one will arrest you for this. Now suddenly when they are arrested for federal crimes, then suddenly they go into this kind of protest saying, no, you can't arrest us here. We're immune from federal law. That's not true.
All right, let's move on to the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The Supreme Court back in April actually ordered the Trump administration to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia. It is now June, Senator. Should President Trump have had and ordered him to be returned sooner than right now?
Yeah, they have gone through the legal back and forth on this, and I know some lawyers said, hey, it's not required. Others said it was, based on how they would argue that out. They've argued it out. That's what happens in the justice system. A federal grand jury has now indicted him. He has been returned under the indictment of a federal grand jury for human smuggling, and he will face then those charges. Then probably, if he's convicted, will face prison time with that. So that is the justice system working through the process.
Well, Senator, isn't the point that Abrego Garcia or anyone should have due process first before they are deported and sent to a Salvadoran prison?
So every person is given due process, but someone who is not a citizen of the United States has very different due process than someone who is a citizen of the United States. The administration has been very, very clear. Everyone gets due process here, but if you're an American citizen, you're facing a court, you're going through a jury, you're going through all those things that American citizens have those right for. But I would tell you, many individuals, when they cross our southern border, are told by a federal law enforcement official that arrests them, this is what you have violated and you're being returned. If you're along our border, and it was so even in the final days of the Biden administration, I watched it happen where they were literally picked up, were told you violated federal law, and with hours returned around.
Well, it is worth noting the Constitution does say that all persons in the U.S. Are entitled to due process. Right. Doesn't make a distinction about citizenship. I do want to move on, though, to this extraordinary fight.
Just one quick statement on the due process, as the court has ruled on an American citizen, citizen is different than someone who's not legally present in the country. It's a faster process. Literally reading to them the statute and saying this is what you violated does count as due process depending on how they've actually entered into the country.
But, I mean, the U.S. has provided due process even to terrorists, Senator. You're saying that people who are here who don't have citizenship aren't entitled to due process, even though the Fifth Amendment
not saying that at all, because not saying that at all. I'm just saying the due process is different for a citizen and a non-citizen.
Okay.
It's a much faster process for a non-citizen often.
Okay, let's move on to this extraordinary fight between President Trump and Elon Musk. On Tuesday, Musk posted that anyone who votes for the big, beautiful bill, the so-called big, beautiful bill, should be fired in the next election. President Trump told me Musk would, quote, have to pay very serious consequences if he starts funding Democrats. He wouldn't say exactly what those consequences are. Are you comfortable with the president warning there will be very serious consequences for someone who supports Democratic candidates?
We have a lot of social media drama going on between two of the most active social media individuals in the world, actually, back and forth on that. And I know a lot of people are focused on that. I would tell you what we're focused in on is the very straightforward issue that we face. If we don't address this issue about the tax bill, every American's taxes will go up January the 1st, because when the calendar changes, tax rates go up significantly. We're trying to fight to make sure that doesn't happen. We don't want tax rates to go up on every single American. We also want to be able to deal with wasteful spending in areas where we know we can address. We have trillions of dollars in overspending. We're trying to address as many of those as we possibly can in this bill, finish it, and then move on to the next. This is the first step in a long process to be able to get our budget back under control.
Senator, let me ask you specifically about what Elon Musk is saying about the bill. He says it will, quote, massively increase the already gigantic budget deficit and burden American citizens with crushingly unstable debt. In 2022, Senator, you posted, quote, for the sake of our nation, it's time Congress actually tackled the debt and deficit and stop the spending. So do you agree with Elon Musk that this bill just adds too much to the debt?
I do not, actually, and I will continue to stand by the statement I made in 2022. I've made those statements for well over a decade now. We've got to address the deficit. We've got to be able to tackle this. Here's the assumptions that the Congressional Budget Office makes. The Congressional Budget Office makes the assumption we're going to have this giant tax increase next year. That's not going to affect the economy. That's not going to slow the economy down. We're going to have the same amount coming in and the same economic activity. No one really believes that's true. If you have a giant tax increase in January, it will slow the economy down, it will hurt economic activity, and you'll actually have less dollars coming in. So if you don't want fewer dollars coming in, then you've got to be able to deal with that tax policy. So what we're trying to do is, as much as possible, keep the tax rates the same as what they are. Only in Washington is that called a giant tax decrease, when you're trying to be able to keep them the same as much as you can, and at the same time to be able to deal with some of our what's called mandatory spending, things like Medicaid. I would say we've talked a lot about Medicaid over the years. The Medicaid program right now is set up where the federal government gives $9 for every $1 a state puts in for a healthy adult, but for a disabled child, the federal government puts in $1.3 for every $1. Well, that's backwards, and we don't have any kind of work requirements as we do with the rest of our social safety net. We're trying to be able to fix that.
Let me jump in here, Senator, because I want to ask you about your trip to the Middle East, and we're almost out of time. You made several stops, including to Israel. Here's what you said about Gaza in an interview after your trip. You said, quote, it's unexplainable how much destruction has occurred. Some people think the Palestinians should be temporarily moved out, but they can't live in tents for a decade. Given that and the conversations you had, do you support President Trump's plans for the U.S. to take over and develop Gaza? We have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, we're not taking over Gaza by any means. This is not America's responsibility to be able to take over Gaza and be able to run it. There are other countries that have support Palestinians but don't support Palestinians actually moving to their country. But you've got 2 million people there, many of them civilians that are totally innocent, had nothing to do with Hamas. They're living in the debris field there. And right now the Israelis are getting food boxes in for a week's worth of food and delivering in a totally different way and trying to establish the process for other Gulf states and others to come in and to be able to do rebuilding in that area. So it is important on the humanitarian side of things, but it's important also that Gaza cannot run Hamas cannot run Gaza, and we cannot have terrorists living right there, and we certainly cannot have Hamas continue to be able to hold Israeli hostages.
All right, Senator James Lankford, thank you so much for bringing us that update to your trip and your other insights. We really appreciate it. When we come back, Democratic Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey joins me next.